For 4 days, the Alpha King's legendary Black Hound refused every meal and waited quietly to die beside an empty bowl. Warriors, priests, and healers all failed to save him. Then a nameless slave girl walked through the rain with nothing but a piece of bread. And before sunset, the beast that terrified an entire kingdom bowed his head to her. No one realized that single act of kindness would change the fate of the Alpha King, awaken an ancient bond, and end a tradition built on chains. The road leading to Iron Moon Fortress disappeared beneath endless sheets of cold rain. Dark clouds covered the mountains like heavy blankets, hiding every trace of sunlight. The wind carried the smell of wet pine trees, smoke from distant chimneys, and the sharp scent of iron that always surrounded soldiers in chains. Slowly, a long caravan climbed the muddy path. Wooden wheels groaned under impossible weight. Rusted cages shook with every bump in the road, and exhausted horses lowered their heads as if they had forgotten what it felt like to walk without fear. Inside those cages sat people who had lost everything. Old farmers, young mothers, brothers separated from sisters, children who had stopped asking where home was because nobody ever answered. No one cried anymore. Silence had become easier than hope. At the very back of the caravan walked a young woman wearing a faded gray cloak. Her boots were covered with mud. A small leather pouch rested against her waist, filled with dried herbs collected long before she became a prisoner. Her name was Lyra. She had once been known as the quiet healer of a mountain village where flowers grew between stones and wolves never attacked children. That life now felt like another person's memory. A tiny hand suddenly grabbed her sleeve. Lyra looked down. A little girl with tangled blonde hair stared up at her with frightened blue eyes. The child could not have been older than 6. "Are we going somewhere bad?" she whispered. Lyra glanced ahead toward the fortress standing on top of black cliffs. Its towers disappeared into mist. Massive walls surrounded it like the ribs of some sleeping giant. Nobody smiled there. Even from far away, the place felt lonely. She gently brushed rainwater away from the little girl's forehead. "I don't know," Lyra answered honestly. The girl lowered her eyes. After a few seconds, Lyra added softly, "But I'll stay with you." The child slowly nodded. Sometimes courage wasn't loud. Sometimes courage was simply refusing to let another frightened person stand alone. The slave traders shouted from horseback, "Move!" No stopping. One man cracked his whip through the air. Several children flinched. An elderly woman stumbled into the mud. Nobody helped her. Nobody except Lyra. Without speaking, she reached down and lifted the woman back onto her feet. One trader noticed. "Save your strength, healer." Lyra didn't answer. Kindness had never required permission. As the fortress gates slowly opened, every prisoner noticed something strange. There was no shouting from inside. No training soldiers. No barking commands. Instead, dozens of guards stood perfectly still. Their attention wasn't on the caravan. It was focused on the center of the courtyard. Something had changed. The caravan rolled through enormous iron gates, and immediately the reason became clear. Bulls. Dozens of them. Some made of silver. Some made of wood. Some filled with fresh meat. Others with warm broth. Every single one untouched. Broken across the stone floor. Deep claw marks covered nearby walls. A heavy silence filled the courtyard. One trader frowned. "What happened here?" A guard answered without looking away. "The Alpha King's hound." Another guard quietly added. "He hasn't eaten for 4 days." The trader laughed nervously. "A dog refuses food. That's the problem." Nobody laughed with him. One older soldier slowly shook his head. "That isn't a dog." The words hung in the cold air. Then everyone heard it. Slow, deep breath. Like thunder trapped inside stone. From the shadows behind iron bars, 2 golden eyes opened. Children immediately hid behind adults. Even hardened soldiers instinctively stepped backward. A giant black hound slowly walked into the light. His shoulders reached the height of a grown man's chest. His fur looked darker than midnight. Old battle scars crossed his face and neck. His paws left silent prints on the whetstone. He wasn't chained. He didn't need chains, because nobody dared approach him. The little blonde girl squeezed Lyra's hand until her fingers hurt. Is he going to eat us? Lyra looked carefully. She noticed his ribs beneath thick fur. His movements were slow. His head remained lowered. His ears barely reacted to noise. The guard saw a monster. She saw exhaustion. She saw grief. One servant approached the cage carrying another silver bowl. Fresh roasted meat filled the air with rich scent. The servant pushed it inside. The hound didn't move. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Finally the servant sighed. He won't touch it. Another servant whispered. That's the 15th bowl today. Nearby soldiers exchanged worried looks. They say he stopped eating after Prince Rowan died. They were together since they were pups. No healer can help. No wolf elder can help. Even the Alpha King cannot help. Above the courtyard, hidden behind stone columns, stood Alpha King Kaelen. Silent. His black cloak moved gently in the wind. His expression never changed. For 4 days he had watched his oldest companion slowly disappear. Every meal failed. Every attempt ended in rejection. Even Shadow refused to look at him. Loss had taken enough already. Kaelen had stopped believing anything could change. Then he noticed someone unexpected. The young prisoner wasn't staring with fear. She was kneeling beside several children. One little boy held half a piece of hard bread. He quietly offered it to Lyra. You eat. She smiled. No. You need it. So do you. The boy looked down. There isn't enough. Lyra gently broke the bread into tiny pieces. Nearby sat a forgotten wooden bowl containing warm broth prepared for the prisoners. She mixed the bread into the broth until it softened. The smallest children watched every movement. One little girl whispered, "That's yours." Lyra smiled. Food shared tastes better. The guards noticed her standing. Immediately voices filled the courtyard. Stop! Stay away! Don't go closer! The beast attacks everyone. Lyra kept walking. Her steps remained calm. Rain quietly landed on her hair. The giant black hound slowly lifted his head. Golden eyes met gray ones. Nobody moved. No magic appeared. No ancient symbols glowed. Only silence. Lyra reached a place several feet from the cage. She didn't stretch her arm toward him. She didn't force anything. She simply placed the bowl on the whetstone. She stepped backward. Once. 3 times. Giving him space. Giving him choice. The entire fortress seemed to stop breathing. Shadow stared at the bowl. Then at the woman. Then at the frightened children gathered behind her. The little blonde girl whispered, "Please." Nobody knew whether she was speaking to the hound or to hope itself. The wind carried a single yellow leaf across the courtyard. Shadow's nose twitched. One slow step. Then another. His claws clicked softly against stone. The guards tightened their grip on their weapons. Traders quietly prepared to run. Even Kaelen leaned forward from the balcony without realizing it. Shadow reached the bowl. For a long moment he simply stood there. The rain continued falling. Lyra never looked away. There was no fear in her face. Only quiet understanding. Finally, the giant black hound lowered his head. He took one careful bite. Then another. Then another. Warm broth disappeared from the bowl. Soft bread vanished with it. Complete silence covered Iron Moon Fortress. One guard accidentally dropped his spear. The sound echoed across the courtyard. A servant covered her mouth. An old soldier slowly wiped tears from tired eyes. "I never thought I'd see this again," he whispered. The little blonde girl hiding behind Lyra smiled so brightly that even strangers noticed. She laughed. Tiny laugh. But after days of chains and fear, it sounded like sunlight. Above them, Alpha King Kaelen stared without speaking. Shadow had ignored priests, ignored elders, ignored him. Yet he had accepted food from a woman carrying nothing except kindness. Something deep inside the king shifted. Not trust, not love, not destiny. Only the smallest crack in walls built by years of grief. Shadow finished the last drop. Then, instead of returning to darkness, the enormous beast slowly sat beside the empty bowl. His tired eyes remained fixed on Lyra, as if remembering something long forgotten. And for reasons neither of them could explain, the lonely healer and the grieving hound no longer looked like strangers standing in the rain. They looked like two broken souls who had silently recognized the same pain. Far beyond the fortress walls, thunder rolled across the mountains. No one knew it yet, but the kingdom's oldest legend had just begun with nothing more than a wooden bowl, a piece of bread, and one woman who chose compassion when everyone else chose fear. The rain finally stopped just before sunset. Drops of water still slid down the black stone walls of Iron Moon Fortress, reflecting the orange light of hundreds of torches that slowly awakened as darkness spread across the kingdom. Servants quietly cleaned the courtyard where something impossible had happened only an hour before. The empty wooden bowl still rested near the giant iron cage. No one dared move it. Some believed it had become a symbol. Others believed it had become an omen. The guards spoke in hushed voices. "I've served here 15 years. I've never seen Shadow eat from anyone." Another guard glanced toward the fortress tower. "The Alpha King hasn't spoken since." Silence settled again. Inside the highest chamber of the fortress, Alpha King Kaelen stood beside a narrow window overlooking the valley below. The mountains stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted in fading shades of blue and silver. Normally the view brought him clarity. Tonight it brought questions. Behind him stood his captain. "Your Majesty." Kaelen didn't turn. "What happened today?" The captain hesitated. The woman approached the Hound. "I saw that. She offered broth." "I saw that too." The captain lowered his voice. "But I cannot explain why Shadow trusted her." Kaelen remained motionless. Neither could he. For 4 days Shadow had rejected food, ignored commands, and turned away from every familiar face. The beast had mourned in complete silence after Prince Rowan's death. Kaelen understood that silence, because he carried the same emptiness inside himself. For years he had ruled through discipline. No celebrations. No unnecessary kindness. No weakness. The kingdom respected him. But no one truly knew him anymore. Except one creature. And even Shadow had slowly disappeared into grief. Now a stranger had reached him with nothing but patience. That disturbed the king far more than any enemy army. A knock echoed against the chamber door. "The council has gathered." Kaelen finally turned. "Bring them." The council hall was built from ancient gray stone. Massive wolf statues guarded every corner, their eyes glowing softly from enchanted crystals hidden inside. Long wooden tables formed a circle beneath hanging lanterns. Every council member stood when Kaelen entered. Not from affection, from duty. Lord Varric spoke first. "The woman cannot remain inside the fortress." Another elder nodded. "She may be a witch." A silver-haired priest added. "No ordinary human could calm the king's hound." General Dorian crossed his arms. "Perhaps she belongs to another pack. A spy. A poisoner. A curse." The room quickly filled with suspicion. Only Kaelen remained silent. Finally he asked one question. "What did she request in return?" Nobody answered. He looked around the room. What gold? What title? What freedom? Still silence. Captain Aldrin finally spoke. She asked if the smallest child could sleep somewhere warm tonight. The entire council became quiet. Kaelen's expression didn't change. But something inside him tightened. She had stood before the most feared beast in the kingdom. She had asked nothing for herself. Only for a frightened child. Lord Varric recovered first. Compassion can be deception. Perhaps. But deception usually asks for something. No one argued. Kaelen rose from his chair. Bring the healer to the palace. Several nobles immediately protested. Impossible. She is still a slave. The prison cells are below. Kaelen looked at them once. The room instantly became silent. My decision is final. Outside, servants carefully guided the prisoners toward lower quarters. Children huddled together against the cold. Lyra helped the elderly woman from the caravan climb a small staircase. A young guard suddenly approached. You! A turn. The Alpha King requests your presence. Every prisoner froze. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked terrified. The little blonde girl grabbed Lyra's hand again. Don't go. Lyra knelt beside her. It's all right. What if he hurts you? Lyra smiled softly. Then you must be brave enough for both of us. The child slowly nodded. A servant gently took the little girl's hand. We have warm blankets. The girl's eyes remained fixed on Lyra until they disappeared around a corner. The palace corridors were unlike anything Lyra had ever imagined. Tall windows reflected moonlight across polished stone floors. Blue lanterns burned without smoke. Ancient paintings watched silently from every wall. Yet despite the beauty, the place felt empty, almost lonely. No music, no laughter, only footsteps. Then something unexpected happened. A familiar sound echoed behind her. Heavy pause. The guard looked over his shoulder. No! Another servant whispered. He's following. Shadow walked through the corridor completely unchained. Servants quickly moved aside. Guards instinctively reached for swords. The giant black hound ignored everyone. His eyes remained fixed on Lyra. She stopped walking. So you're hungry again. Shadow sat quietly. His enormous tail moved once against the floor. The nearest guard nearly dropped his spear. I've never seen him do that. Another servant covered her mouth. He's acting like. She never finished the sentence. Because Alpha King Kaelen appeared at the end of the corridor, Shadow immediately stood. For one brief second, Lyra expected the beast to run toward his master. Does it? He stayed exactly where he was. Beside her. Kaelen noticed. Every servant noticed. Nobody spoke. The silence somehow became louder than words. Finally Kaelen walked closer. He stood only a few feet away. Up close, Lyra noticed tired eyes that belonged to a man carrying years instead of days. His voice remained calm. What is your name? Lyra. You are a healer. I try to be. You weren't afraid. She looked toward Shadow. He wasn't angry. Several guards exchanged confused looks. Kaelen asked quietly. What did you see? Lyra answered after a long pause. A creature waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. For the first time in years, the Alpha King forgot to speak. Nobody in the palace dared mention Prince Rowan anymore. Not after his death. Not after the silence that followed. Yet this unknown woman had understood without being told. Shadow slowly lowered himself onto the floor beside Lyra. Resting. Peacefully. Kaelen stared at his oldest companion. 4 days without rest. 4 days without food. Now the beast finally looked calm. The king realized something unexpected. The fortress itself felt different. Not brighter. Not happier. Simply quieter. As if grief had finally taken one slow breath. A young servant arrived carrying a tray. Bread. Warm soup. Fresh water. She nervously placed it before Lyra. Lyra immediately looked around. Can the little girl from the caravan eat first? The servant blinked. You haven't eaten all day. She is still growing. The servant looked toward Kaelen. He simply nodded. Bring food for both. The servant hurried away. Kaelen watched Lyra sit beside Shadow on the polished floor. She didn't try to touch him. Didn't command him. Didn't even look at him. She simply waited. After a moment, the giant hound quietly rested his head beside her shoulder. A gesture of complete trust. Every guard witnessed it. Every servant whispered about it. And somewhere deep beneath the walls he had built around his own heart, Alpha King Kaelen felt something unfamiliar. Not destiny. Not certainty. Only the smallest possibility. That perhaps healing could arrive as quietly as snowfall. Outside the palace windows, clouds slowly drifted away from the moon. Silver light spilled across Iron Moon Fortress. And in hidden corners of the kingdom, messengers had already begun carrying impossible rumors. The Alpha King's Black Hound had accepted a stranger. The Silent King had spared a slave. And for the first time in many years, hope had entered the fortress without asking permission. Morning arrived slowly over Iron Moon Fortress. Instead of bright sunlight, soft silver mist drifted between the ancient towers, wrapping the dark stone walls in a peaceful silence. Dew rested on the castle gardens, and tiny birds landed on old statues that had watched over the kingdom for centuries. For the first time in many years, the fortress did not wake to shouting soldiers or clashing steel. It woke to something much quieter. Children laughing. The sound was small, almost forgotten. Yet every servant who heard it stopped for just a moment. Some smiled without realizing it. Some simply listened. Because laughter had become rare inside walls built by grief. Lyra carried a stack of dusty books through a long hallway lined with stained glass windows. The palace steward had given her a simple task. The old royal library has been abandoned for years, the elderly woman had explained. Organize what you can. No one goes there anymore. Lyra had nodded. Books had always felt like old friends. Unlike people, they never shouted. They simply waited patiently until someone opened them. As she pushed open the heavy wooden doors, dust floated into the morning light like tiny stars. Thousands of books rested on towering shelves. Some leaned sideways. Some had fallen completely. Spider webs connected forgotten corners. Ancient maps covered the walls. Broken ladders stood against endless rows of history. It smelled of old paper, cedar wood, and quiet memories. She smiled. It's beautiful. Behind her came the familiar sound. Heavy pause. Slow footsteps. Shadow entered the library without hesitation. The enormous black hound walked between towering shelves with surprising gentleness. He sniffed the air once before choosing a place beside the tallest window. Then he simply lay down. His massive head rested on crossed paws. Golden eyes half closed. Watching. Not guarding. Just existing. Lyra placed her hand on the nearest bookshelf. I think you like quiet places too. Shadow blinked once. That was answer enough. Hours passed peacefully. She carefully repaired torn pages with thin strips of cloth. She stacked books according to age. She dusted forgotten journals. Occasionally she paused to read a single sentence before smiling softly. Outside, rain clouds drifted away, allowing warm light to spill across the wooden floor. Even Shadow seemed more relaxed. His breathing had become deeper, steadier. The servants noticed. One whispered from the doorway. He hasn't slept like that since the prince died. Another quietly nodded. I almost forgot what peaceful looks like. Near midday, tiny footsteps echoed through the hallway. The little blonde girl from the caravan peeked around the door. Behind her stood 3 other children, which looked equally nervous. One little boy carried a wooden toy wolf missing one leg. May we come inside? Lyra looked toward Shadow. The giant hound remained completely still. You may. The children entered carefully. Every pair of eyes stayed fixed on the enormous black creature. The smallest girl whispered, Will he bite? Lyra smiled. Only if you steal his soup. The children giggled. Shadow slowly opened one eye before closing it again. The little boy holding the broken toy gathered unexpected courage. Step by step he approached. Every servant watching from outside stopped breathing. The child reached Shadow. Very carefully. He placed his tiny wooden wolf beside the giant hound's paw. "For you." Shadow lowered his nose and gently sniffed the toy. Then he rested his head beside it, accepting the gift. The little boy grinned so widely that even the palace guards couldn't hide their smiles. By afternoon, the forgotten library no longer felt empty. Children sat in circles on old rugs. Lyra opened a faded storybook. "Once," she began softly, "a lonely wolf searched every mountain for a place that felt like home." The children leaned closer. Shadow listened with closed eyes. Outside the door, several servants quietly gathered. One kitchen maid whispered, "I haven't heard stories since I was little." An old guard slowly sat against the wall just to listen. Even passing soldiers slowed their steps. The library became the quiet heart of the fortress, without anyone planning it. Meanwhile, on the highest balcony, Alpha King Kaelen reviewed military reports, trade routes, border disputes, council complaints. Nothing unusual, until Captain Aldrin approached. "Your Majesty." Kaelen looked up. "What is it?" The captain hesitated. "You should see something." Neither of them spoke as they walked through silent corridors. When they reached the library entrance, Kaelen stopped. Children sat around Lyra as she read. Shadow slept peacefully beside them. One little girl had fallen asleep against the giant hound's side. Another child carefully brushed leaves from his thick black fur. Nobody was afraid. Nobody cried. Nobody hid. The impossible had become ordinary. Kaelen remained completely still. Captain Aldrin quietly smiled. "I don't think they've noticed us." They hadn't. Inside the library there was only soft storytelling. And the lonely wolf finally realized that courage wasn't fighting every battle. Lyra turned another page. It was choosing not to face them alone. The children listened with shining eyes. Kaelen found himself listening too, without meaning to. He could have entered, could have spoken. Instead he simply stood there, watching. For years he believed strength required distance. Kings ruled. Soldiers obeyed. Feelings remained hidden. Yet this unknown healer had entered the fortress with nothing except kindness. Now children laughed where silence once ruled. Shadow slept without fear. Even servants smiled more often. No command from a king had ever accomplished that. Days quietly passed. The routine became familiar. Morning cleaning, afternoon stories, evening healing. Whenever injured workers arrived, Lyra treated scraped hands and tired feet without complaint. She never asked for payment. She never asked for freedom. She simply helped whoever stood before her. And every single day, Shadow followed. One rainy afternoon, Kaelen entered the library alone. Lyra stood on a ladder reaching for old books. Without warning, one heavy volume slipped. Before it could fall, a large hand caught it. She looked down. The Alpha King stood below. For a second neither moved. "Thank you," she said quietly. Kaelen glanced at the title. History of Northern Wolves. It's falling apart. It survived 300 years. So did this library. For the smallest moment, the corner of Kaelen's mouth almost smiled. Almost. Lyra climbed down carrying several dusty books. "You should read this one." Kaelen looked surprised. "You recommend books to kings. I recommend books to anyone willing to listen. What is it about?" "A ruler who believed fear made him strong. And he discovered loneliness always wins eventually." Kaelen looked at the worn leather cover for a long time, then accepted it. No ceremony, no speeches, just quiet understanding. Near sunset, the children prepared to leave. The little boy with the wooden wolf secretly placed 3 tiny white flowers beside Shadow's sleeping paws. The giant hound opened one eye. He didn't move. He simply guarded the flowers all night. When servants discovered them the next morning, whispers spread throughout the fortress. The beast protects gifts from children. The healer speaks with kings. The castle feels different. Even old cooks noticed soldiers laughing during meals. Stable workers sang while repairing fences. The silence that once felt heavy had become peaceful instead. Not everyone welcomed the change. Far below the library, inside the council chamber, Lord Varek stared toward the window with narrowed eyes. A messenger bowed before him. The people have begun calling her the quiet healer. Another noble frowned. They admire her. They admire the king more since she arrived. Varek slowly folded his hands. No kingdom changes because of kindness. His voice became colder. It changes because someone allows kindness to become power. He looked toward the fortress tower where children still laughed. Find out who she really is. Back inside the library, twilight covered shelves with warm golden light. Lyra finished placing the final repaired book into its proper place. Shadow stood and stretched. The children had gone. Only silence remained. Peaceful silence. She gently looked around. I think this place remembers happiness. Shadow walked toward her. Then quietly rested beside her chair. Outside, unseen by both of them, Alpha King Kaelen paused in the hallway. For several moments he simply listened to the quiet. No battles. No arguments. Only turning pages and slow breathing. It was a sound he thought he had lost forever. And somewhere beyond the library walls, hidden beneath duty, grief, and years of careful control, the first fragile threads of trust began weaving themselves together. Neither the king nor the healer recognized them yet. But the old library did. Because some stories begin with thunder, and others begin with two lonely souls sharing the same silence. The peaceful rhythm inside Iron Moon Fortress lasted exactly 12 days. For 12 mornings, children laughed in the old library. For 12 evenings, Shadow rested beside the fireplace instead of pacing through empty halls. For 12 nights, the Alpha King found himself standing outside the library door for reasons he never tried to explain. Even the servants had begun whispering that winter somehow felt less cold. Then, on the 13th morning, the fortress bells rang 3 slow times. Every smile disappeared. Every guard reached for a weapon. Every soldier hurried toward the main gate. Something was coming. Lyra was arranging herbs near the library window when she heard the first shout. Open the gates. Trader convoy approaching. Children immediately stopped reading. The little blonde girl looked toward the courtyard. Are new people coming? Lyra walked to the window. Far below, dozens of wagons climbed the stone road. Heavy chains dragged behind them. The sound echoed through the valley like broken promises. She didn't need to see any closer. She already knew. Another slave caravan. The room suddenly felt colder. Shadow stood before anyone else moved. His ears lifted. Golden eyes fixed on the gates. Without making a sound, the giant black hound walked toward the exit. Lyra quietly followed. By the time they reached the courtyard, soldiers had formed 2 perfect lines. The massive gates slowly opened. Wooden carts rolled inside. The smell arrived first. Wet wood. Mud. Old blood. Fear. Several traders laughed while counting coins. To them, people were numbers. Nothing more. Inside rusted cages sat frightened villagers. An elderly man held his injured arm. A young mother covered her sleeping baby's ears. 3 little boys shared one torn blanket. One tiny girl stared silently through broken wooden bars. She couldn't have been older than 5. One trader proudly announced, "Strong workers. Healthy children. Good prices." Nobody answered. Even the soldiers looked away. Lyra stepped closer. Immediately she noticed a small boy sitting against the corner of one cage. His face was pale. One ankle was bleeding where iron had rubbed through skin. He wasn't crying. He simply looked exhausted. She knelt beside the wagon. "Does it hurt?" The boy looked at her. "A little." A trader walked forward. "No touching merchandise." The word hit the courtyard harder than any shout. Merchandise. Not child. Merchandise. Lyra slowly stood. He needs treatment. He needs a buyer. Several traders laughed. The boy lowered his head. High above the courtyard, Alpha King Kaelen watched from the balcony. Beside him stood Lord Varek. This is normal trade. Kaelen didn't answer. The kingdom profits from labor. Still silence. Varek continued. One healer cannot change tradition. Kaelen looked toward the wagon below. Lyra was still standing there, completely alone, surrounded by armed men. Yet she had not stepped away. The trader grabbed the injured boy by the arm. Move! The child cried out. Without hesitation, Lyra placed herself between them. You are hurting him. The trader laughed. And who are you? She answered calmly. Someone who can still tell the difference between a child and cargo. The courtyard became perfectly silent. No one spoke to slave traders that way, especially not a former prisoner. The trader's smile disappeared. You should remember your place. My place, Lyra replied softly, is beside someone who cannot protect himself. The little boy slowly looked up. For the first time in days, someone had chosen him. Shadow quietly walked forward. The giant black hound stopped beside the wagon. His enormous body stood between the frightened children and the traders. He didn't growl. He didn't show his teeth. He simply sat, watching. The message was unmistakable. The children instinctively moved closer to him. One little girl carefully reached toward his fur. Shadow remained perfectly still. Even fear seemed to trust him. The traders suddenly became nervous. One whispered, "Move the beast." Another shook his head. "I'm not going near it." A third looked toward the palace. "Where is the king?" Almost as if answering the question. Heavy footsteps echoed across the stone courtyard. Every soldier immediately lowered his head. Alpha King Kaelen descended the long staircase without speaking. His black cloak moved gently behind him. His expression remained unreadable. He stopped in front of the wagon. The injured boy stared at the ground. Lyra never moved. The trader forced a smile. "Your Majesty, we bring valuable workers." Kaelen's eyes shifted toward the bleeding child, then toward the chains, then toward Lyra. Finally he asked, "How old is he?" The trader shrugged. "Old enough to work." The answer hung in the air. "Cold. Me. Won't." Kaelen slowly reached toward his side. Every guard expected him to arrest Lyra. Every trader expected punishment. Does it? Steel quietly left its sheath. The Alpha King's sword reflected morning sunlight. Without warning, he swung once. Metal shattered. The child's chains fell onto the stone floor. Nobody moved. The little boy stared in disbelief. Kaelen stepped toward the next cage. One strike. Another chain broke. Then another. Then another. One by one, children stepped into freedom. Some didn't move at first. They didn't believe it was real. Lyra knelt beside them. "It's all right. You can come out." A little girl burst into tears and hugged her without warning. The elderly soldiers watching nearby quietly wiped their eyes. Lord Varek rushed forward. "Your Majesty, this violates centuries of law." Kaelen finally looked at him. "What law demands children wear chains?" Varek couldn't answer. The silence was answer enough. The traders immediately protested. "This is our property. We paid for them. Our contracts." Kaelen interrupted with one sentence. "They are people." Simple words. Yet the entire courtyard seemed to change. Servants stood taller. Soldiers looked directly at the prisoners instead of through them. The frightened children slowly gathered around Lyra and Shadow. Hope moved through the fortress one heartbeat at a time. Then Kaelen did something no one expected. He handed his sword to Captain Aldrin. "Bring oil." The captain hesitated only a second, then nodded. Within minutes soldiers poured barrels of oil across every empty slave wagon. The traders shouted in panic. "You can't! Our business! Our money!" Kaelen remained completely still. He took a single torch from the wall. For one long moment he looked at the wooden carts that had carried fear across countless kingdoms. He dropped the torch. Flames climbed instantly. Orange fire raced across dry wood. Smoke rose toward the gray sky. Children watched silently as the cages disappeared beneath light. Chains cracked from heat. Old wheels collapsed. Years of suffering turned into ash. The little blonde girl from the library stood beside Lyra. "Will anyone be locked inside again?" Lyra gently brushed hair from her face. "Not today." The girl smiled. Tiny smile. But powerful enough to make nearby servants cry. Shadow stood before the burning wagons without fear. The fire reflected in his golden eyes. For the first time since Prince Rowan's death, the giant black hound lifted his head proudly. Not in anger. In peace, Kaelen noticed. Their eyes briefly met across the flames. Neither spoke. Words weren't necessary. Both understood that something irreversible had happened. Around them, ordinary people quietly began making impossible choices. Kitchen workers brought bread. Stable boys carried blankets. Soldiers lifted exhausted children onto their shoulders. No order had been given. Compassion simply spread from one person to another. Like fire. Only warmer. Not everyone welcomed the change. Far beyond the crowd, hidden beneath a dark cloak, a stranger watched everything. A silver wolf crest rested against his chest. The mark of the northern Fong pack. He slowly unfolded a small piece of parchment. With careful handwriting he wrote, "The Alpha King destroys the slave trade. He protects an unknown healer. The people are beginning to love them both." He rolled the message closed. A black raven landed beside him. Moments later it disappeared into the sky. Evening settled over Iron Moon Fortress. The last flames slowly faded into glowing embers. Where cages once stood, children now sat around warm fires eating fresh bread. The injured little boy leaned against Shadow's side while Lyra wrapped his ankle with clean cloth. He looked up at her. "Will they take us again?" Before Lyra could answer, another voice spoke quietly. "No." Everyone turned. Alpha King Kaelen stood beside them. His gaze rested on the children, then on Lyra. "As long as Iron Moon Fortress stands, no child will wear chains here again." The promise drifted through the silent courtyard. No cheers followed. No celebration. Only quiet relief. Because sometimes the strongest oath isn't shouted. It's spoken softly enough that frightened hearts finally believe it. Far above, stars slowly appeared between the clouds. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the fortress walls, enemies had already begun planning how to destroy the fragile hope that had just been born. Winter settled gently over Iron Moon Fortress. Instead of storms, soft snowflakes drifted through the mountain air, covering rooftops, gardens, and old stone walls with quiet white light. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, and every morning children rushed into the courtyard to leave tiny footprints across untouched snow. The fortress had changed. Not because new laws had been written. Because people had changed. The old kitchen that once served only soldiers now prepared extra bread for orphan children. Stable workers built small wooden sleds. Servants left blankets outside guest rooms without being asked. Even the guards who had once frightened everyone now smiled whenever little hands waved at them. The greatest surprise of all rested beside the main gate. Shadow. The giant black hound who had once been feared across every territory now patiently allowed children to decorate his thick black fur with tiny woven ribbons. He never moved. He simply sat proudly while three little girls argued over which color looked best. Nearby, Lyra quietly laughed. It was a soft sound, rare enough that everyone who heard it looked toward her, even Alpha King Kaelen. From the balcony above, Kaelen watched the courtyard in silence. Captain Aldrin stood beside him. The people are happier. Kaelen nodded once. They work harder. Another nod. They fear you less. For the first time, Kaelen actually looked away from the courtyard. Is that a problem? The captain smiled slightly. No. I think it is called trust. The word remained in Kaelen's thoughts long after the captain left. Trust. He had ruled through strength, through discipline, through distance. Somehow, a quiet healer had accomplished something he never could. Without commands, without power, without asking for anything. Far below, Lyra knelt beside a young wolf pup that had injured its paw chasing birds through fresh snow. The tiny animal whimpered. She gently wrapped clean cloth around the leg. There. You'll be running again tomorrow. The pup licked her hand. Nearby children clapped happily. Shadow slowly walked over and nudged the little wolf toward safety. The giant beast behaved less like a monster every day. More like an old guardian who had finally remembered how to rest. That same afternoon, ancient bells echoed through the fortress. Blow. 3 times. Every elder immediately stopped what they were doing. One servant whispered, "The Moon Council has arrived." Even Kaelen frowned. The Moon Council rarely traveled unless old traditions were threatened. By sunset, 6 silver-cloaked wolf elders entered the great hall. Their hair had turned white with age. Their eyes carried centuries of memory. No one interrupted them. No one dared. The eldest woman stepped toward Shadow first. The giant hound calmly lowered his head. She placed one wrinkled hand against his fur. Then slowly turned toward Lyra. Without warning, she stopped walking. Her expression changed. Confusion. Then surprise. Then something almost impossible. The other elders noticed immediately. One quietly whispered, "Do you smell it?" Another closed his eyes. "I do." The room became perfectly silent. Kaelen watched every reaction. "What is it?" The oldest elder looked from Lyra to Kaelen, then back again. Finally she spoke. "There is a mate bond." Several council members immediately stood. "Impossible." Kaelen's expression never changed. The elder continued. "The scent exists. The connection exists. But," she hesitated, "it sleeps." Nobody understood. One younger elder slowly opened an ancient leather journal. Dust floated into the candlelight. He carefully turned yellow pages, then stopped. His voice became almost a whisper. "There are records. Very old ones. A mate bond may remain dormant when both souls carry unbearable grief." The room fell silent again. Every eye moved toward Kaelen, then toward Lyra. Neither reacted. Neither felt the overwhelming pull described in old stories. No racing heartbeat. No glowing marks. No uncontrollable instinct. Only quiet familiarity. The kind that had grown between library shelves and snowy afternoons. Lord Varek immediately stood. "This is dangerous." Another noble agreed. "If the bond is broken, our laws become uncertain. The neighboring packs will question the throne." An elder nodded slowly. "They already might." Kaelen finally spoke. "She is under my protection." Lord Varek answered. "That may become the problem." Outside the hall, Lyra walked through falling snow completely unaware of the debate happening inside. The little blonde girl ran toward her carrying a crooked snowman made from 3 uneven circles. "I made Shadow." Lyra looked carefully. "It needs bigger ears." The child laughed. Together they carefully shaped the snow while Shadow watched with complete seriousness. Soon every child joined them. Tiny mittens pushed snow into impossible shapes. One built a wolf. Another built a castle. One little boy accidentally covered Shadow's tail with snow. The giant hound simply sighed. Even Lyra couldn't hide her smile. From a distant window, Kaelen quietly watched. He had attended dozens of council meetings. Won wars. Negotiated treaties. None of those memories remained in his thoughts now. Is it? He watched one woman teaching children how to build snow wolves. Captain Aldrin appeared beside him. "You've been standing here for 20 minutes. Kaelen answered without looking away. They laugh differently now. They do. They sleep without nightmares. They do. After a moment the captain smiled. So do you. Kaelen didn't answer. Days passed. The council continued debating. Messengers arrived from neighboring territories. Questions became demands. Who was the healer? Why did the Alpha King's hound obey her? Why did ancient elders claim a sleeping mate bond existed? Rumors spread faster than winter wind. Some called Lyra blessed. Others called her dangerous. She remained completely unaware. Her days never changed. Morning healing. Afternoon stories. Evening walks with children and shadow through snow-covered gardens. One evening she returned to the library carrying a basket of herbs. She found Kaelen already there. Not reading. Simply standing beside the large window where snowflakes drifted through moonlight. Neither spoke immediately. Silence had become comfortable between them. Finally Lyra placed another log into the fireplace. Warm light filled the room. You should rest. Kaelen looked toward her. I do. You work too much. So do you. She smiled slightly. The children keep me busy. They trust you. They trust Shadow. For a brief moment both looked toward the giant hound sleeping near the fire. His breathing remained slow and peaceful. The wooden toy wolf still rested between his paws. The tiny white flowers the little boy had given him days earlier had dried completely. Yet Shadow still guarded them. Kaelen quietly noticed Lyra looking at the flowers. He never lets anyone move them. Lyra smiled. He remembers kindness. Kaelen answered almost without thinking. So do you. The words surprised both of them. Silence returned. Not uncomfortable. Until outside snow continued falling. Inside firelight danced across old books. Neither reached for the other's hand. Neither felt ancient magic. Smell. Neither wanted to leave. Hidden behind a half-closed door, Lord Varric watched everything. His expression hardened. The bond grows. An advisor whispered. But nothing has awakened. Varric slowly folded his hands. Then someone else will awaken it. Far beyond the fortress walls, ravens carried secret messages toward rival packs. Political tension quietly spread through the kingdom. While inside the warm library, Lyra read another story to sleepy children. Shadow rested nearby. Kaelen listened without pretending he wasn't listening. And the ancient mate bond that should have burned like wildfire continued to grow the way winter flowers bloom. Slowly, silently, patiently, waiting for wounded hearts to believe they deserved happiness again. The oldest wolf legends always spoke of destiny arriving with thunder. But Iron Moon Fortress was beginning to learn a different truth. Sometimes destiny arrived carrying a storybook, a basket of herbs, and enough kindness to heal creatures that had forgotten how to hope. Night arrived without warning. The last colors of sunset disappeared behind the frozen mountains, leaving Iron Moon Fortress wrapped beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. Fresh snow covered every rooftop, every stone path, and every pine tree surrounding the castle until the entire kingdom looked carved from silver. Most of the fortress had already fallen asleep. The kitchen fires burned low. The guards walked slow circles along the walls. Children rested peacefully beneath thick blankets, holding wooden toys and storybooks Lyra had repaired for them. For the first time in many winters, nightmares did not echo through the orphan rooms. Peace had finally found a place inside Iron Moon Fortress. But peace always attracts those who fear it. Far beyond the outer walls, 5 dark figures stood among the trees. Black cloaks blended into the winter night. Their faces remained hidden. Only their voices disturbed the silence. The healer must die. The children are symbols now. The Alpha King grows stronger because of her. One assassin slowly pulled a dagger from beneath his cloak. Moonlight reflected across the blade. We leave no witnesses. Without another word, they disappeared into the falling snow. Inside the library, only a single lantern remained lit. Its warm glow danced across endless shelves filled with forgotten stories. Lyra sat beside the fireplace repairing another torn book. Nearby, 4 children had fallen asleep together beneath one large blanket. The little blonde girl still held the crooked wooden wolf she refused to sleep without. Shadow rested beside the door. His eyes were closed. His breathing was slow, peaceful. One ear moved. The giant black hound slowly lifted his head. Silence. Absolute silence. But somewhere beneath the wind, another sound existed. Single step. Then another. Shadow stood immediately. His golden eyes narrowed toward the dark hallway. Lyra looked up. What is it? The hound didn't move. Every muscle in his body became still. Waiting. Listening. Outside, snow continued falling. 5 shadows climbed the fortress walls using hidden ropes. They avoided torchlight. Avoided patrols. Moved like ghosts through forgotten passages that had not been used for generations. One whispered, "The library." Another nodded, "They're inside." Without warning, Shadow released a deep growl. It echoed through the empty hallway. The sleeping children stirred. Lyra stood. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The library doors suddenly burst open. 3 masked figures rushed inside. Steel flashed beneath lantern light. The oldest child screamed. Everything happened at once. Shadow moved first. The giant hound launched himself between the children and the attackers with impossible speed. One assassin swung a blade. Shadow blocked the strike with his own body. Metal scraped against thick fur before cutting across his shoulder. The beast didn't retreat. He stood taller, protecting the frightened children behind him. Another attacker tried to push past. Shadow roared. The sound shook dust from ancient bookshelves. The assassin stumbled backward in fear. "Run!" Lyra shouted. She gathered the smallest children toward the hidden reading corner. The little blonde girl was crying. "I don't want Shadow to get hurt." Lyra pulled her close. "He won't leave us." Even as she spoke, she saw blood falling onto the wooden floor. Dark drops against old stone. Shadow had been wounded. Yet he never stepped away from the children. Outside, alarm bells exploded across the fortress. Guards rushed from every direction. Captain Aldrin drew his sword. "Protect the library." Soldiers raced through snowy corridors. But someone reached the danger first. Alpha King Kaelen. He had been unable to sleep again. Something restless had kept him walking the palace halls. Then he heard Shadow's roar. A sound he had not heard since the battlefield years before. Without hesitation, Kaelen ran. His cloak disappeared behind him as he crossed the frozen courtyard. Snow scattered beneath every step. When he reached the library entrance, he saw the impossible. Shadow stood bleeding. Children huddled behind Lyra. 3 assassins advanced with drawn blades. Something inside the Alpha King broke. Not control. Not discipline. Grief. Old grief. The same grief that had stolen his brother. The same grief that had almost taken Shadow. Never again. Kaelen entered without a word. His sword left its sheath in one smooth motion. The attackers immediately understood their mistake. Within moments, soldiers surrounded the room. The assassins threw down their weapons. But Kaelen wasn't looking at them. His eyes remained fixed on Shadow. The giant hound was still standing. Still protecting the children. Even while blood slowly stained the snow that had drifted through the open doorway. Lyra immediately knelt beside him. "No!" She pressed clean cloth against the wound. Shadow looked only at her. Completely calm. As if pain no longer mattered. Kaelen quietly lowered himself beside them. For years he had never allowed anyone to see fear on his face. Now every servant watching understood. He was afraid. Not for himself. For the family he had almost lost again. Lyra worked quickly. Her hands never shook. Warm water. A servant ran. More cloth. Another arrived. The children stood silently nearby. The little blonde girl slowly removed the blue ribbon from her hair. She placed it beside Shadow's paw. So you get better. One by one, every child added something. Tiny flower. Carved stone. A wooden toy. Small treasures offered with complete faith. Then something extraordinary happened. A single drop of Shadow's blood touched the ancient stone beneath the library floor. For centuries forgotten runes hidden beneath the fortress quietly awakened. Soft silver light spread through cracks in the stone. No explosion. No thunder. Only gentle light. It slowly surrounded Shadow. And Lyra. Then Kaelen. Finally the frightened children standing behind them. Thin silver threads connected every heart in the room. The oldest wolf elder, arriving with the guards, stopped walking. Tears filled her eyes. It isn't only a mate bond. Everyone looked toward her. She smiled softly. It is a healing bond. A promise that broken souls can become whole together. No one spoke. Snow drifted through the broken doorway. Silver light reflected across old books. Shadow slowly lowered himself onto the floor. Not from weakness, from peace. For the first time since Prince Rowan's death, the giant black hound closed his eyes without fear. His breathing remained steady. Lyra never moved her hand from his fur. Kaelen quietly remained beside them, not as a king, simply as a man who had nearly lost another family. Around them, frightened children slowly stopped crying. The little blonde girl whispered. Shadow stayed. Lyra smiled through tired eyes. He always will. Outside, dawn began touching the mountains with pale silver light. The assassins had failed. The fortress still stood. Hope still lived. And somewhere deep beneath grief, duty, and ancient wolf traditions, the sleeping bond between the quiet healer and the lonely Alpha King had taken its very first heartbeat. Morning arrived beneath a sky of pale silver. Fresh snow covered the courtyard where the battle had taken place only hours before. The broken footprints of soldiers had already disappeared beneath a new layer of white, as if winter itself wanted to erase the memory of violence. But memories were not so easily buried. Inside Iron Moon Fortress, every servant spoke in whispers. The children were safe. The assassins had been captured. Shadow was alive. Yet another danger had quietly entered the kingdom. Fear. The great council hall had never felt colder. Tall windows allowed gray winter light to fall across the ancient stone floor where generations of Alpha Kings had stood before the Wolf Council. 6 silver-robed elders occupied the eastern seats. Nobles filled the western side. Military commanders stood near the entrance. No one smiled. No one spoke above a whisper. At the center of the chamber stood Alpha King Kaelen. Silent. Unmoving. Only the faint shadow beneath his eyes revealed that he had not slept. Lord Varric rose first. The assassination changes everything. Another noble immediately agreed. The neighboring packs already questioned the sleeping mate bond. A third elder slowly nodded. And now ancient healing magic has awakened. Murmurs spread across the hall. One council member finally spoke the words everyone had been avoiding. The healer must leave. Silence followed. The sentence felt heavier than any sword. Captain Aldrin took one step forward. She saved the king's companion. She protected our children. She has done nothing deserving exile. Lord Varric answered immediately. That is exactly the problem. Every eye turned toward him. The people trust her. The soldiers respect her. The children follow her. If rival packs believe she influences the throne, war becomes inevitable. His words echoed through the chamber. Many nobles reluctantly lowered their heads. Not because they hated Lyra, because they feared uncertainty. Kaelen remained silent. Outside the council windows, Snow drifted gently across the fortress gardens. 4 years every difficult decision had been simple. Protect the kingdom. Accept sacrifice. Carry the burden alone. Now the answer no longer seemed clear. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the debate, Lyra sat inside the library changing Shadow's bandages. The great black hound rested beside the fireplace while children quietly read repaired storybooks around him. The little blonde girl carefully tied another blue ribbon around his neck. There. Now you'll heal faster. Shadow slowly wagged his tail once. The children laughed. Even injured, he still made them feel safe. Lyra gently brushed snow from his fur. You scared everyone. Shadow rested his head against her shoulder. The library once again became peaceful. For a brief moment, the world outside seemed far away. Then the palace steward entered. Her eyes carried sadness. The council requests your presence. The children immediately looked worried. The little boy who had once worn chains stood. Did she do something wrong? The old woman smiled softly. No. But even she wasn't certain. When Lyra entered the great hall, conversations stopped. Every noble watched her. Every elder studied her. She walked quietly toward the center of the chamber. Shadow followed despite his injury. Nobody tried to stop him. The giant hound calmly sat beside her, like he always did. The eldest moon elder slowly stood. Lyra, you have brought healing where grief once lived. You have changed this fortress. But old laws are powerful. She paused before continuing. If neighboring packs believe an uncertain mate bond threatens the throne, civil war may follow. The meaning became painfully clear. Someone had to leave. And everyone expected that someone to be Lyra. She lowered her eyes. If leaving protects the children, I will go. The room became perfectly silent. She asked for nothing. Not freedom. Not reward. Only peace. Kaelen's hands slowly tightened. For the first time in years, he realized that duty could feel like losing someone before they were gone. Before anyone could answer, a tiny voice interrupted the silence. No. Every head turned. The little blonde girl stood in the open doorway. Behind her came the little boy with the wooden wolf. Then another child. And another. Soon nearly every orphan from the fortress quietly entered the council chamber. None of them looked afraid. They simply walked toward Lyra. The smallest girl gently held her hand. If she leaves, who reads us stories? Another child stepped forward. Who fixes our toys? An older boy added. Who taught us monsters can be kind? Shadow quietly lifted his head. The chamber remained silent except for children's voices. One elderly servant slowly walked forward. I have worked here 40 years. I have never seen this fortress feel like a home until she arrived. A kitchen cook stepped beside her. She eats after everyone else. A stable boy smiled. She healed my horse. A wounded guard removed one glove. She stitched this hand when everyone else was busy. One by one, ordinary people left their places. Not nobles. Not heroes. Just people whose lives had quietly become better. No speeches. Only simple truths. Captain Aldrin looked toward the council. The kingdom already chose. No one answered. 'Cause everyone could see it. The strength of Iron Moon Fortress no longer rested only in walls or soldiers. It rested in trust. Something impossible to command. Something impossible to buy. Lord Varek slowly looked around the chamber. Children standing beside soldiers. Servants beside commanders. The giant black hound resting beside a healer. Even the elders remained silent. For the first time, he understood that fear no longer ruled the fortress. Hope did. And hope was much harder to defeat. Alpha King Kaelen finally stepped forward. His voice remained calm, but every word carried absolute certainty. For many years, I believed a king protects his people by standing above them. He looked toward the children. I was wrong. His gaze moved toward Lyra. A king protects his people by standing with them. The great hall became completely still. No healer who protects this kingdom will be exiled. No child who calls this fortress home will be abandoned. No law built on fear will decide their future. The words echoed against ancient stone. Not shouted, simply spoken. And somehow that made them stronger. Outside, sunlight finally broke through winter clouds. For the first time in weeks, golden light touched the snow-covered courtyard. The children ran outside laughing. Shadow slowly followed them, still wearing his blue ribbon. Lyra stood beside the palace doors watching them play. Kaelen joined her. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Across the courtyard, the little boy who once arrived in chains built a snow wolf with the smallest children. The little blonde girl placed flowers on its head. Even soldiers stopped to help. The fortress looked different. Not because the walls had changed. Because the hearts inside them had. Far beyond the mountains, rival packs still gathered. Political storms were still coming. Ancient secrets still waited to awaken. But inside Iron Moon Fortress, something stronger than fear had quietly taken root. A lonely king had begun trusting. A quiet healer had found a place to belong. A wounded black hound had become every child's guardian. And an entire kingdom had discovered that real leadership was not measured by power, but by the courage to choose compassion when every tradition demanded otherwise. The first rays of sunlight reflected across the snow like silver threads connecting every soul in the fortress. None of them noticed, but the sleeping maid bond did. It waited patiently, knowing that hearts healed by kindness always find each other in the end. Spring arrived so quietly that no one noticed the exact day winter ended. The snow that had covered Iron Moon Fortress for months slowly disappeared beneath warm sunlight. Tiny streams carried melted ice through the gardens, and fresh green grass pushed its way through cracks in ancient stone. Where slave wagons had once stood, flowers now bloomed, hundreds of them. White lilies, blue mountain bells, golden wildflowers planted by small hands that had once worn chains. Every child in the fortress called it the Garden of New Beginnings. No walls surrounded it. No locks guarded it. Only laughter and hope. Early that morning, Lyra walked through the garden carrying an ordinary wooden bowl. It was old. Its edges were worn smooth by years of use. Most people would have thrown it away long ago. But she had carefully cleaned it and kept it beside the library fireplace. Because some simple things deserved to be remembered. Behind her, a group of children followed with tiny watering cans. The little blonde girl smiled. Is today Shadow's feast day? Lyra laughed softly. I think every day is Shadow's feast day. The children giggled. Even after everything they had survived, they still found reasons to laugh. That alone felt like a miracle. Near the palace steps, Shadow waited. The giant black hound looked healthier than he had in many years. His thick black fur shined beneath the morning sun. The scar across his shoulder had healed into a thin silver line. Around his neck rested a simple blue ribbon that the children refused to remove. Every morning they tied a fresh one. Every morning Shadow accepted it with complete dignity. The moment he saw Lyra, he slowly stood. His massive tail moved once, then twice. The smallest children cheered. He knows. He remembers. Of course he remembered. Lyra knelt exactly where she had knelt months before. She poured warm broth into the wooden bowl. Pieces of soft bread floated on the surface. Nothing expensive. Nothing royal. Just kindness. She gently placed the bowl on the ground, then stepped back. Exactly as she had done on the first day. Shadow looked at the bowl, then at Lyra, then calmly lowered his head and began eating. The children laughed so loudly that birds flew from nearby trees. Several palace servants secretly wiped tears from their eyes. One old guard whispered, "It all began with that bowl." Another nodded. "No. It began with someone willing to set it down." From the palace balcony, Alpha King Kaelen watched everything. Captain Aldrin stood beside him. The council has accepted the new laws. Kaelen remained silent. No more slave caravans. No forced labor. The neighboring packs have begun following our example. Still Kaelen said nothing. His attention never left the garden below. Children chased butterflies around Shadow. Lyra helped the smallest boy plant another flower. Nobody looked afraid anymore. Captain Aldrin smiled. "You changed the kingdom." Kaelen quietly answered. "No." She reminded us what it was supposed to be. Later that afternoon, the old library was filled with sunlight. The dusty shelves no longer looked forgotten. Children had placed tiny painted wolves between books. Fresh flowers rested beside ancient maps. Broken chairs had been repaired. Empty corners had become reading spaces. Life had quietly claimed every silent room. Lyra carefully returned the last restored book to its shelf. She heard footsteps behind her. She already knew who it was. Kaelen stopped beside the window. Neither of them spoke. Silence had always belonged to them. Outside, children laughed in the garden. Inside, pages gently moved beneath the spring breeze. After a long moment, Kaelen looked toward the repaired shelves. "When I was young, my brother believed every damaged book deserved another chance." Lyra smiled. "He was right." Kaelen nodded. "So were you." For several seconds, neither moved. There was no rush, no dramatic music, no impossible destiny pulling them together. Only two people who had spent months quietly healing beside one another. Kaelen slowly extended his hand. Not as an Alpha King, simply as a man. Lyra looked at it, then placed her hand in his. The moment their fingers touched, a soft silver light flowed between them. Gentle, warm, like moonlight resting on calm water. It traveled through their joined hands without sound, without force, without fear. The old wolf elders, watching from the doorway, smiled. One quietly whispered, "The bond has awakened." Another slowly shook her head. "No. It has finally healed." Outside, Shadow suddenly lifted his head. The giant black hound walked toward the library entrance. The children followed behind him. When they reached the doorway, they stopped. They saw Lyra and Kaelen standing together beneath golden afternoon light. Neither looked surprised. Neither looked overwhelmed. They simply looked peaceful. The little blonde girl tugged Shadow's ribbon. "I knew it." The little boy holding his wooden wolf grinned. "I think Shadow knew first." The giant hound calmly sat beside them, as if agreeing. That evening, the entire fortress gathered in the garden. No throne had been prepared. No royal ceremony waited. Long wooden tables filled with warm bread, soup, roasted vegetables, and fresh fruit stretched beneath blooming trees. Servants sat beside soldiers. Children sat beside elders. No one cared about titles. The fortress had become something different. Home. The oldest moon elder slowly stood. "For generations, we believed strength belonged to those who ruled through fear." She looked toward Kaelen. "Today we witnessed another truth." She turned toward Lyra. "A kingdom grows strongest when kindness survives suffering." Silence followed. Not empty silence. Content silence. The kind that comes when every heart already understands. As stars slowly appeared above Iron Moon Fortress, the children ran through the garden chasing glowing fireflies. Shadow followed them at a slow pace. Whenever the smallest child stumbled, the giant hound quietly positioned himself nearby until tiny feet found balance again. He no longer guarded a lonely king. He guarded an entire family. Lyra watched the scene with gentle eyes. Kaelen stood beside her. "I spent years believing loneliness made me stronger." She looked toward the children. "It only makes people forget what they're protecting." He nodded. Then, for the first time in many years, the Alpha King smiled without restraint. Not because a war had been won. Not because enemies had surrendered. Because children laughed beneath open skies. Because old wounds had become quiet scars. Because a black hound no longer waited to die. Long after the celebration ended, one wooden bowl remained beside the palace steps. Moonlight rested inside it like liquid silver. An old servant noticed it and asked, "Should I take it away?" Lyra gently shook her head. "No. Why?" She looked toward Shadow sleeping peacefully among the children. Some stories deserve to stay exactly where hope first found them. The servant smiled. And somewhere deep within the silent mountains, the oldest wolf legends quietly changed. People would one day say that Iron Moon Fortress was saved by an alpha king, a fearless healer, and the kingdom's fiercest black hound. But those who truly lived the story knew a different truth. The fiercest creature inside the fortress had never been the great black hound. Had been loneliness. And loneliness was defeated not by magic, not by power, not by destiny, but by one quiet woman who placed a simple wooden bowl on cold stone and waited with kindness until a broken heart chose to live again.